Unaware, his wife had just won a $50B contract. Daniel Carter slammed the apartment door with the certainty of a man who thinks exits are destiny. At the table, Sarah Carter steadied their blind daughter's white cane and guided 7-year-old Emma's hand to the warm bowl, then spoon. Unaware his wife had just won $50B contract. He divorced her and his blind child to marry his. The headline was already writing itself as he dragged 2 designer suitcases over scuffed linoleum and jabbed at his phone, texting Victoria Chen like a man punching a future into being. "This," he said, sweeping a hand over second-hand furniture and alphabetized medical bills, "isn't a life." Sarah didn't look up from measuring protein into milk. "It's our life," she said. "And temporary," he laughed without humor. "Marcus wants me in development. VP. Victoria sees my potential. He tried the dagger he'd practiced. Without me, you're nothing." She gave him no theater. "You can't do this," she said softly, then corrected herself so truth could live in the sentence. "You already did." Papers slid across the table. Divorce, custody, the line where a father could sign himself into a ghost. "Clean break," he said, brisk, like erasing a calendar event. He looked everywhere except at the white cane by the door and the child who tilted her face toward the sound of his shoes. "Daddy?" Emma asked. Hope a habit stronger than evidence. Sarah rested a hand on her daughter's shoulder and read the clauses like a field medic triaging shrapnel. Waived assets, waived alimony, relinquished parental rights, language designed to convert a family into a vacuum. "Marcus thinks I'm single, unattached, hungry," he went on. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." He kissed his phone, not his child, and shouldered the suitcases. At the threshold, he paused, eyeing the ring on Sarah's finger like it owed him one more apology. "Get a real job," he said. "You'll thank me." She turned the laptop toward herself, because discipline is a kind of faith, tapped the portal, and watched a nation-sized sentence bloom across the screen. Awarded National Infrastructure Modernization Project. 10 years, $50 billion. The largest federal deal in the country's history, and it carried her firm's name. She did not gasp. She did not run after him with revelation like a bouquet. She looked at Emma, whose hand trust-mapped the table's edge, and at the white cane that would become an instrument, not a sentence. "We have work," she said, barely above a breath, which is how vows prefer to be spoken when they plan to last. From the hall came the rumble of wheels rolling toward a lobby that would not applaud him today. Sarah closed the divorce packet without signing, opened a new document, and began her outline. Attorney, controller, lead engineer, pediatric hematology billing. She met her eyes in the microwave's dull reflection and allowed one heartbeat of grief for the man who taught her how cheaply ambition dresses itself. Then she shelved it beside the salt. "Mama?" Emma asked. "What does the rain sound like?" Sarah smiled, so the answer would be true. "Like drums for a parade we're building," she said. She slid off the ring, laid it flat on the counter like a memo marked obsolete, and lifted her gaze to the darkening window where the storm was forming. Somewhere below, a door shut. A future rehearsed its lines. He, "You can't do this." She, "I already did." In writing, her lawyer would say soon, "Receipts don't rage, they remove." Sarah reached for the cane, placed it in Emma's hand, and let the vow fix itself in glass and weather and breath. Not to rage, but to rebuild louder than thunder, quieter than humiliation, and notarized by morning. Outside, the first drops tapped the sill like coins. She chose the work. Twice. Now. Deliberately. The break didn't arrive like a thunderclap. It seeped through tiny seams, first in the way Daniel started calling her firm boutique, with a smirk that shrank 15 years of grit into a hobby, then in the way he declared lean and sold their modest house as if square footage were the culprit, and finally in how his calendar stopped, including Emma's mobility lessons, while his camera roll swelled with gala selfies, where ambition gleamed like lacquer. Meanwhile, Sarah learned to map the city the way Emma did, by sound and touch, and patience, counting crosswalk beeps as measures, cataloging the warm bread smell at the corner bakery as a landmark, turning every errand into an act of engineering. Routes, redundancies, tolerances, fail-safes. At Children's Memorial, she revised sections of the federal RFP under fluorescent lights that flattened everyone into the same shade of weary, lifting her eyes whenever Emma's fingers hesitated over a braille line, whispering definitions like lullabies, foundation, resilience, span until her daughter smiled at the shape of words she could feel. Procurement calls came at impossible hours, and she took them from stairwells and playrooms, switching from mother to principal engineer between heartbeats, promising deliverables as if promises were girders no storm could twist. When the project manager from the department asked how a small firm would scale for a mandate so vast, she listed names of people who had stayed when invoices were late, women who laid rebar and ran models and never once asked whether the work was too heavy, and men who measured twice even when no one was watching, because integrity, like concrete, fails from the inside first. Daniel, meanwhile, discovered new synonyms for gravity, trajectory, optics, alignment, and wore them like cologne, practicing introductions in the mirror that erased wife and child with the efficiency of a squeegee. At a winter networking gala, Victoria's sequins caught a light that reflected in his pupils like prophecy, and Sarah saw it, the way a structural crack announces itself to trained eyes, hairline thin and already fatal if unstitched. She had once believed marriage was a bridge that could be widened with patience. Now she understood some spans are miscalculated at the foundation, designed on fantasy loads, built with shortcuts no inspection catches until the first real stress. So she did what engineers do: audited, recalibrated, reinforced. She met with a pro bono benefits counselor and renegotiated Emma's therapy schedule to minimize fatigue, applied for adaptive tech grants, and tested 3 screen readers to find the one whose cadence matched Emma's curiosity. She compiled a hiring slate for post-award scale-up that prioritized apprenticeships for girls who loved math but had never been invited to prove it, and drafted a supplier diversity plan so sharp and honest that a reviewer scribbled, "Finally," in the margin. Nights in the apartment were small but unbroken tea, steam, braille dots, the tap-tap of a cane practicing arcs along masking tape lines she had laid on the floor. Mornings were measured in checklists and courage. When fatigue pressed her skull like a vice, she closed her eyes and pictured the first rural bridge she would replace, saw the school bus that would no longer detour 40 minutes around a failing span, saw a farmer cross before the river rose, saw floodwater bow politely to culverts, sized by physics instead of wishful budgets. She added line items for community meetings where designs would be argued into better shapes by the people who lived beneath them. She thought of Daniel less as a villain now and more as an equation solved. Inputs known, outputs predictable, variance unacceptable. If he imagined her collapse as inevitable, he misunderstood what held her up. It wasn't him, not ever. It was the work, the child, the oath she kept to both. And so when the contract award finally arrived, like sunrise compressed into a sentence, she didn't sprint toward revenge. She walked toward responsibility, steady as form work, heart aligned not to spectacle, but to load-bearing truth. She would build what lasts. And she would teach Emma that darkness isn't emptiness when your hands know where the edges are. The day the award went public, Sarah was in the hospital family lounge, helping Emma thread elastic onto a beaded bracelet the mobility instructor used to teach tactile sequencing. The beads were smooth, then ridged, then faceted, a tiny universe of edges her daughter translated into order. And in that quiet, she felt the vibration in her pocket as if the phone itself had a heartbeat, push notifications stacking, emails chiming. A senator's scheduler asking for 5 minutes that would inevitably become 20. She silenced everything except the call she was waiting for from accounts about bridging finance and told Emma, 3 more beads. Captain, then we go conquer lunch. Word traveled faster than thunder. Carter Engineering Solutions had been a stubborn entry in 1,000 procurement spreadsheets. Now it was an anchor, a mandate, a headline that converted old colleagues into sudden admirers and longtime skeptics into opportunists rehearsing contrition. She let it wash past. She had more immediate math. Payroll for the 3 senior hires she'd promised if the award came in, a retainer for a benefits consultant to wrestle the labyrinth of specialized coverage for adaptive devices, and a relocation to an apartment that placed Emma within a 10-minute roll of the pediatric clinic. On rounds, the occupational therapist adjusted Emma's cane grip and swapped out a worn marshmallow tip. You're getting consistent arc width, the therapist said. And Emma's grin was a lighthouse. Sarah could feel more than see. Consistency was a theme she could engineer into steel and into mornings. She met with her controller in the cafeteria and sketched a burn chart on a napkin. Onboarding curve, tooling timeline, bond requirements, then sent a note to her attorney with a cool, unflinching sentence about responding to the divorce packet on her terms, with protections that didn't invite drama, but didn't fear it either. By mid-afternoon, the governor's office wanted a photo. She countered with a site meeting next week at a flood-prone culvert 3 counties over, the kind of optics she preferred. Boots, measures, the thud of a soil density gauge. Jennifer appeared with coffee, and the laugh that always sounded like permission to keep going. They sat shoulder to shoulder, while Sarah drafted the first internal memo of the next decade principles, not platitudes. Deliver what we promise. Design for maintenance. Embed accessibility. Publish change orders instead of burying them. And assume the person crossing our bridge is someone we love. Daniel's name surfaced only as a ripple in conversations she refused to host. Still, gossip arrived, like spam. He'd been seen at a private club with a watch that could buy a neighborhood's textbooks. He'd used the phrase fresh start loudly enough to be overheard. He'd bragged about a mentorship with Marcus that sounded like a coronation in rehearsal. Later that evening, after Emma fell asleep to a children's audiobook and the gentle metronome of the air purifier, Sarah opened the late emails she'd ignored on principle and answered each with the same unadorned voice. Thank you. Here are the milestones. Yes, we will meet with your team. No, we are not accelerating procurement without environmental review. Here is our apprenticeship outline. Here is where your university can help. Here is where you must not get in our way. Her cursor hovered over his number, once a phantom ache, a reflex as old as their first apartment, and then she moved the mouse, sent a calendar hold for a Saturday morning walk lesson with Emma instead, and chose that future. She packed boxes only when Emma was awake, so the sounds were narrative, not alarm. Tape tearing, books thumping into crates, the cane tapping the perimeter of rooms that would soon be memory. In the new place, she measured cabinet heights and labeled them in Braille. She installed a small bell on the balcony door so Emma would always hear when the outside wanted in. When the night finally bent toward quiet, Sarah stepped onto that balcony and listened to the city's unlulling. Buses sighing, late trains confessing their lateness, distant sirens like threads pulled through fabric. Somewhere across town, a man built a life on borrowed scaffolding. Here, she set piers. Here, she wrote a schedule that began with a child's hand on a rope and ended with a bell everyone could hear. The invitation arrived, heavy as a verdict thick card, gold emboss, calligraphy that curled Daniel's new future into something that tried to look timeless. And for a long minute, Sarah only stood by the kitchen counter, the card balanced in her palm, while Emma traced a Braille story about a girl learning the shapes of wind. Jennifer came in with grocery bags and a reflexive protective scoff. Absolutely not. We're not feeding this to your calendar. But Sarah slid the envelope open anyway, felt the small, absurd, electric shock of seeing both names joined where hers had been erased, and understood that closure sometimes requires walking into a room that practiced your absence. She told herself it wasn't spectacle she was after, but stillness, the kind you win when the story you survived tries to perform itself without you and learns you carry the original ending. So she scheduled an extra mobility session for Emma, arranged a playdate with the tech coach who turned screens into music, and spent the saved evening fitting the navy dress Jennifer produced from a garment bag like a talisman, its clean lines a blueprint in cloth. The morning of, she reviewed project milestones with her deputy over coffee, declined 2 more interviews with the same quiet sentence. Our work speaks louder from a site visit than a studio, and texted the pediatric nurse her ETA after lunch, so Emma's infusion would start on time. Then she braided her daughter's hair by touch, so the part lay straight, kissed the smooth brow that had outlasted more fear than any child should, and let the taxi take her to an address that had never learned humility. The Chen estate unfolded like a thesis on inheritance gravel that sounded expensive under tires, hedges trimmed into the kind of obedience money buys, a facade that sold the fantasy of permanence, and inside, light fell from chandeliers like curated weather, while a string quartet gave even awkward silences a soundtrack. People noticed her the way a room notices an unexpected door, first with denial, and then with narratives. Was that the woman from the articles, the one with the bridge renderings that made mayors weep and bond markets purr? Guests who'd read headlines rearranged their faces into politeness too late to be kindness. And those who hadn't let their eyes skim her dress for clues found none, and resorted to pity powdered as curiosity. Sarah took a flute from a passing tray, stood with Jennifer at the back, like load-bearing columns, and watched without swallowing the urge to laugh at how much stagecraft it took to make inevitability look spontaneous. Daniel moved at the altar with the posture of a man hired for his silhouette, a tuxedo doing as much heavy lifting as his promises, while Victoria swept down the aisle in a gown that moved like investment beautiful, yes, but also eager to amortize. In the small stillness before the vows, Sarah thought not of revenge or regret, but of calibrations, the dull thud of a soil density gauge at a site visit next week, the way Emma counted steps to orient to a new hallway, the cadence of her firm's onboarding so no one failed for lack of context. She felt a quiet affection for the version of herself who, months earlier, would have begged this room to see her worth, and she sent that version a benediction it had earned. You were always more than the audience's appetite. A bridesmaid's bracelet snapped somewhere mid-aisle, beads skittering like startled punctuation across marble, and the quartet modulated to cover the ripple. A guest whispered, "That's her," as though discovery were a sport, and Jennifer's fingers flexed around Sarah's hand, a silent offer to exit if the theater turned carnivorous. But the only hunger Sarah felt was for the next week's work, and her daughter's laugh at dinner time. She stood, she breathed, she counted the seconds between a father of the bride's anecdote and the officiant's cue, and she understood the architecture of this day, grandeur suspended over rot, a lattice woven from omissions, a scene that would not survive contact with weight. If closure had a sound, it wasn't applause or denunciation. It was the quiet click of a door she could walk through either way and be whole on both sides. So when the officiant asked the room to rise and the polished air obeyed, Sarah's spine lengthened, her breath settled, and she lifted her chin not toward the stage, but toward the future that had nothing to prove to chandeliers. Marcus Chen took the microphone with the unhurried certainty of a man who signs checks. The weather obeys, and as the quartet's last chord dissolved into crystalline whispers, he said the word that tilts rooms. Integrity. It wasn't loud, just load-bearing. Conversation faltered, waiters stalled, and even the chandeliers seemed to listen as he continued, each sentence measured like a ledger entry. He spoke of how a family name is a covenant, how leadership is simply character with a budget, how due diligence is love translated into policy, and then he laid out his findings with the clinical mercy of a surgeon who cuts to save. Daniel Carter, he explained, had presented himself as single and unencumbered, a clean slate with glossy edges. In truth, he had divorced his wife of 12 years mere weeks ago and executed documents relinquishing parental rights to his blind 7-year-old daughter to accelerate this alliance. The gasp rose like steam from 1,000 expensive cups. Someone spilled champagne, a beadwork strap sighed and broke, and the quartet forgot their page turn. Eyes swung to the back where Sarah stood, with Jennifer unmoving, unarmored, undeniable. His former wife, Marcus said, and the phrase landed like a relic, presented and recognized, is Sarah Carter, principal of Carter Engineering Solutions. The firm awarded the federal modernization mandate, 10 years, $50 billion, the largest infrastructure contract in our nation's history. He didn't embellish. He didn't need to. Numbers can announce royalty without trumpets. Daniel stepped toward the mic, mouth already shaping a counter-narrative context. Misunderstanding, the familiar choreography of men who believe explanations are currency. But Marcus lowered his gaze in a way that canceled negotiations before they began. "We welcome mistakes confessed," he said evenly. "We do not welcome patterns hidden." He rescinded the vice presidency with a breath, then rescinded the wedding with the next. And it was as if a scaffold made of compliments and borrowed light collapsed without touching the ground. Victoria swayed. Her mother's hand was at her elbow. Somewhere, a photographer kept shooting because reflex doesn't have ethics. The officiant closed his book in a gesture both kind and relieved. Sarah did not move. She had not come for spectacle, and spectacle, denied oxygen, folded into truth. Victoria's eyes found her through the sudden blur of ruin. She crossed the distance between aisles and expectation and stopped a respectful arm's length away. "He told me you were vindictive," she said, voice soft as torn silk, "that your daughter was a tactic, that you'd wreck his future out of jealousy." The words trembled, but the understanding beneath them did not. "I chose the flattering lie. We all do," Sarah answered. "Once? The important part is what we choose next." Victoria nodded, a small bow to adulthood, and the apology in her face felt like something earned, not performed. Marcus approached then, older, not in years but in consequence, and inclined his head the way leaders apologize when they intend to remember. "Miss Carter Sarah," he said, "I regret my family's role in extending harm." "Convert regret into governance," she replied, not unkind. "Make the policy I needed you to already have." Around them, wealth tried to decide whether it should pretend compassion or practice it. Committees formed in whispers. Opinions backdated themselves in real time. Daniel stood alone on a platform designed to hold two, his posture collapsing by increments, as if he were finally under the weight of his own decisions. He looked toward Sarah with a plea that could not assemble into a sentence, because sentences require subjects that accept responsibility. She met his gaze, the way an engineer inspects a failed beam, without malice, with total clarity, and with the kind of pity that does not offer itself as rescue. Jennifer's hand tightened around Sarah's, their shared signal for exit, for choosing the door that leads back to the life that matters, and together they turned as the room parted in a wave of silent arithmetic, people calculating proximity to a scandal's epicenter and edging themselves into safer margins. At the threshold, Victoria's voice followed, gentler than the strings had been all afternoon. "May I visit the hospital?" "Not for show." Sarah paused, then nodded once. "Bring books with raised stars," she said. She likes to read the constellations with her hands. Outside, the air was ordinary in the glorious way. Air is when a room has tried and failed to rewrite your truth. The gravel no longer sounded expensive underfoot, just small and honest. And far away, the city made the workmanlike music of trucks and trains, the symphony that pays for itself. In the car, Sarah let her head rest against the window and felt only one clean thing, not triumph, not revenge, an exhale built from finished pages. The story that had been rehearsed without her had collapsed on its own staging. The story she was writing would still be there in the morning, asking for checklists and courage and a child's laugh to measure success. Scaling 50 billion was not a headline, but a blueprint, and Sarah treated it the way she treated bridges. Begin at soil, not sky. So, while pundits rehashed the cancelled wedding as if scandal were a renewable resource, she convened a dawn meeting in a borrowed union hall, poured coffee, and sketched the decade on a whiteboard: governance, sequencing, bond capacity, insurance stacks, environmental review calendars, apprenticeship cohorts, safety culture woven into bonuses so deeply it became reflex. She promoted the quiet geniuses who had waited out the lean years, and hired veterans who knew what megaprojects did to timelines if you fed them flattery instead of facts. She wrote a one-page creed: deliver what we promise, design for maintenance, publish change orders, build for the person your daughter could be, and taped it where everyone passed twice a day. The new office sat 2 blocks from Children's Memorial. Glass not to impress but to reflect daylight deeper into the rooms. In reception, tactile signage wrapped each wall like a promise. Elevator buttons had braille that didn't insult fingers with shallow dots, and Emma, small cane tapping, a bright rhythm, served as the unofficial Inspector General of Accessibility. Her palms, discovering omissions adults would have missed. This slope is sneaky, she'd say, feeling a ramp that wanted to pretend it was flat. Sarah added a punch list item, and the facility's crew learned the gospel of 2 degrees. Victoria arrived on Thursdays without cameras, hair in a ponytail, tote bag heavy with raised print storybooks and audio adventures that turned corridors into forests. She did not ask for absolution, and that made friendship possible. 1 chapter at a time, on a window seat that looked over a street where buses sighed and the city kept its end of the bargain. Motion in exchange for taxes, honestly spent. When Marcus suggested a formal collaboration, his factories, her specs, Sarah did what grief had taught and engineering had rehearsed. She wrote terms that made shortcuts impossible, insisted on third-party audits, split profit in tranches tied to delivery and durability, and built clawbacks with teeth so no one could smile past them. Marcus read twice, nodded once, and signed with the relief of a man glad to be forced into his best self. They launched pilot sites, a flood-prone county where culverts were chronically undersized by wishful budgets, a rural bridge that turned school mornings into an hour of detours, an urban bus depot that needed both electrification and shade where drivers could breathe. Sarah stood on dirt and ballast and asphalt, talking with crews whose hands knew distance without rulers, while Emma, in a neon safety vest tailored to her small frame, counted truck beeps and learned the grammar of work zones: high vis, hard hat, hold a grown-up's elbow at the pinch points. Reporters begged for hero arcs. Sarah gave them procurement charts and a calendar of public meetings where residents redrafted plans with the stubborn intelligence that comes from living near consequences. She said no as often as yes, and the project got stronger each time it survived her own skepticism. At night, when the city softened into the purr of tires and the faraway stitching sound of trains on rail, Daniel's texts arrived in uneasy constellations, first furious, then pleading, then practical. Could we talk about a role? I can help with stakeholder relations, as if employment might launder his history. She archived them into a folder labeled Closed, the way you store a design that failed a stress test. On Saturdays, she and Emma practiced route finding to new bakeries, Emma's cane describing arcs that sang against sidewalk seams, while Sarah counted steps aloud until her daughter's grin told her the count had become a map inside her mind. At home, they cooked by sound onion hiss, garlic whisper, a pot's soft applause at boil, and laughed when the timer pretended to be urgent. Payroll met, permits cleared, utility locates scheduled. The first apprenticeship cohort filled in a day with girls who wrote equations in the margins of their notebooks, and boys who learned to listen because the woman at the front of the room knew where failure hid. And when fatigue pressed hard at her temples, Sarah would stand in the doorway and watch Emma read the night through an open window, hands lifted as if the dark itself were text. and she'd remember why accessibility wasn't a compliance task, but a love letter to every stranger who would cross what she built without ever knowing her name. 6 months later, when the email subject line read simply, Riverside, and the body contained nothing but a time and the memory of a bench, Sarah almost deleted it. Closure had already come to her, in forms more durable than apologies payroll met on time. Culverts poured to spec, Emma's hands mapping a new school corridor by counting lockers like constellations, but something in the spareness felt like an end that needed witnessing. So she told Jennifer where she would be, texted the pediatric nurse their slightly later arrival for cane practice, and walked to the river at dusk with the pace of someone who no longer confuses speed with strength. Daniel was there early and looked late tie loose, hair losing the argument with the wind, a suit that tried and failed to assemble him back into the man who had once believed mirrors were proof of progress. He stood as she approached, as if politeness might arrive in time to rewrite history, and for a moment neither of them spoke, because silence has its own inventory. I was wrong, he said finally, voice catching on the simple weight of the words, as though he hadn't lifted anything honest in months, about you, about what matters, about how worth is counted. He described a slow collapse, dressed as a series of surprises, offers that evaporated when references included the word custody, colleagues who discovered that ethics had backbones when Marcus sent his terse, surgical memo about diligence, landlords who preferred tenants who could name their next quarter. Shame loosened his posture further when he tried to say Emma's name and couldn't. The syllables lodged somewhere behind the place he had signed away fatherhood. Can you forgive me? He asked, and she felt the question land without demand, because forgiveness, unlike reunion, is a decision one person can complete alone. I already did, she said, and the truth made the air easier to breathe. Not for you, so I wouldn't keep dragging around what you dropped. He nodded, the movement small as a flinch, and the river kept talking in its old language, insistence, direction, patience, while city lights started stitching themselves into the water. Can I see her? He added, and there it was, the ask that wanted to undo a signature, to erase a document by wishing. Sarah kept her voice quiet, so the refusal would not bruise. You chose not to be her father. I won't rewrite Emma's healing into an obstacle course to accommodate your regret. When she's older, if she asks, if she chooses, I will tell her the truth and let her choose again. But right now, her world is balanced and growing, and I protect that. He pressed his palms together, not in prayer so much as in habit, a man trying to look smaller to fit inside consequence. I traded love for leverage, he said, and for the first time, the sentence sounded like comprehension rather than performance. Then build differently, she answered, hearing in her own voice the cadence she used on sites when a crew needed the next doable thing. Show up where no one claps. Tell the truth when it costs you. Be useful to people who don't owe you anything. A gull carved the air above them. The bench remembered their weight without preference. And for a few minutes they sat with the kind of distance that is not hostility, but boundary. He tried to apologize again, to repackage the same repentance with more adjectives, and she shook her head gently. There is a dignity in endings that don't audition for sequels. She stood first. I have to go, she said. My daughter's waiting to race me to the corner by counting how many bus brakes sigh before the light changes. She wins every time. The smallest smile arrived on his face and left, aware of its own impertinence. Goodbye, Daniel. She walked toward the street, where the crossing sign would chirp and the world would continue to be navigable by sound and intention. Her phone buzzed with a photo from the flood-prone county, a crew laughing in rain gear, beside a culvert that finally behaved during a storm, and another from the office, a line of apprentices, in hard hats, holding rulers like batons, each ping a bright stitch in the fabric of the life she had chosen. At home, Emma met her at the door, with the game already underway. Tap, tap, count, and Sarah let her child's hands lead the way down the hall, past the bell on the balcony door that chimed whenever evening opened, past the tactile labels that made the apartment speak, toward a kitchen that smelled like garlic and relief. Later, when sleep widened the rooms into quiet plains, Sarah stood at the window and let the day file itself, one clear page for mercy, one for boundary, one for the river's lesson, that forward isn't a rush, but a current you learn to join without dropping what you came to carry. On listing day, the bell rope felt like a promise braided into something you could hold, and Emma's small hands guided by a custodian who'd taught dozens of dignitaries, and never once a child who read the world by touch found the thick twist and smiled at its texture. Cameras crowded, traders craned, and Sarah stood a half step behind her daughter in the navy suit she reserved for days when gravity needed to see her respect, thinking not of stock tickers, but of culverts poured to spec and bus depots, shaded so drivers could breathe between routes, of apprentices who had learned to measure twice because the woman at the front of the room had shown them where failure hid. When the bell rang, bright as a sunrise you can hear, confetti unfurled like revised plans, and the room's cheer swelled in a way that might have felt like vindication if Sarah lived on comparisons. Instead, it felt like continuity, the next clean beat, in a song that had started in a waiting room under fluorescent lights, while Emma slept between chemo and courage. Jennifer whooped away ballast laughs, balanced and sure, and Victoria stood beside them without spectacle, a friend who had learned the art of showing up with books that whispered stars into a child's palms. Marcus shook Sarah's hand, the grip of a man grateful for contracts whose teeth made him a better version of himself, and promised he'd personally sit through the audit exit interview like a student staying after class because the lesson mattered. Down on the floor, a ticker spelled out a translation of the last year into numbers the market understood. Up on a rooftop later, beyond the cameras and the clever questions about how it feels, Sarah translated the day back into the language she trusted. Milestones and maintenance, uptime and equity. A city's arteries running clearer because design had remembered the people inside the vehicles. She checked her phone only to read messages that multiplied purpose photos from the flood-prone county where the new culvert had swallowed a storm without complaint. A thank you video from a rural school whose bus route no longer circled a failing bridge like a prayer. A selfie from the first cohort of blind interns posing beneath a banner that read, "Access is design," all grins and hard hats, and hands on CAD keyboards, as if the future had learned their names. Daniel's number appeared once like a drifting buoy on an ocean she no longer sailed. She let it float past without dislike, a footnote outgrown by the body of the work. That evening, back at the office, she walked the corridor where tactile signage curved like a second alphabet, and paused to tighten a loose handrail bracket, because leadership, at its best, looks exactly like care repeated. Emma counted doors 1, 2, 3, then clapped when the kitchen opened and the kettle began its faithful steam, and together they cooked by sound and scent. A family not smaller for its boundaries, but truer. Reporters would keep asking for the revenge arc, because audiences like to believe justice must be loud. Sarah kept giving them site visits and procurement calendars, kept sending them to town halls where residents argued designs into better shapes, kept insisting that the best headline was a bridge you don't notice because it never fails. Later, under a sky that hummed with flight paths and weather moving in honest lines, she stood with Jennifer and Victoria while Emma pressed her ear to the balcony bell, listening to the city's mixed orchestra bus breaks, sighing. Someone's music 3 floors down. 2 cyclists, laughing as if velocity were a joke, you tell together, and Sarah thought of every woman who had ever been told to be grateful for survival and had instead chosen to build, of every child who had learned that darkness is not emptiness when your hands know where the edges are. "What does it look like?" Emma asked, the night a question against her cheek. "Like a promise kept," Sarah answered, and meant the culverts and the contracts, the apprenticeships and the audits, The rope they had pulled that morning and the quieter ropes she pulled every day: discipline, mercy, boundary, love. The past, properly archived, could no longer reach them. What reached them now were buses on time, bridges that held, and a bell that rang again in the memory of everyone who had listened with their eyes closed and heard the future becoming ordinary.